The next segment here, part 5, is the one training course that we were involved in to prepare us to journey via jump room to the planet Mars. So let's take a look at this. In the summer of 1980, here I am with my dear old dad at my brother's wedding in 1985. This is about 5 years later. My dad's health was really actually peaking, and he was really in vital good health during the early 80s. But still was a man who had lost 1/3 of his heart tissue during his heart attack in 1977, and at this point in the summer of 80, he had 11 segments of artery, 11 bypasses in his chest. So while he was very physically vital, his medical record on paper was very compromised. He was apparently in very poor health on paper. But because of proper diet and exercise, he really started to rally physically. And he wanted to go with me to Mars, right from the beginning, as father and son. And we ultimately accomplished that, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. He approaches me at our house in Chatsworth, California, and says, "Son, we're going camping this summer." And I said, "Oh, our mom," and then I asked about one of my older brothers, "Are they going too?" And he said, "No, it's just going to be you and your dad." And I said, "Well, where are we going?" And he said, "Lake Siskiyou, near Mount Shasta." And here's the beautiful Lake Siskiyou. There's a campground on the northern side of the lake over here that looks like it's right beneath Mount Shasta. It's an incredible location. And this is a very beautiful picture of it, but I would definitely urge anybody in this audience who hasn't been to Shasta in the summer to do it at least one summer. It's phenomenal. And so I had remembered Lake Siskiyou from a previous camping trip with a greater number of my family members. And so early one morning, we put our tent in our boat, and one Saturday morning at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, just got onto the I-5 corridor and started traveling north to Shasta from Chatsworth, to Lake Siskiyou from Chatsworth, California. And that was roughly, our trip was roughly undertaken around August 15th of 1980. The first strange thing that happened on our trip was when my dad exited at exit 745, if you're familiar with the I-5 corridor in Northern California, essentially you get into Siskiyou County, which is a very large county, and at exit 745, you go to the northeast for about 9 miles on that exit before reaching the town of McLeod, California. In those days, the parking lot in front of the McLeod Market was much larger, and it had been sort of poured over unplaned earth. So there were sort of these bumps in the parking lot. My dad pulled our station wagon and our boat onto the parking lot at a pretty far distance from the front of the store. And he then turned to me in the car and said, "Son, I'm going to be in the store for about 15 minutes, and I have to ask you that whatever you do, don't leave the car. Unless the car catches on fire, stay in the car." And I said, "Okay, Dad, whatever." And so my dad goes into the store. He comes out 15, 20 minutes later, but where he had been clean shaven when he gave me the advisement in the car, he now had a 5-day growth of beard. The kind of beard we always teased him about, how he looked like Ernest Hemingway when he grew his beard out. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" He says, "Nothing, son. I just went into the store, looked around, saw what was there, if we had to come down here and buy some groceries." And he hadn't bought any groceries. That was another clue. And I said, But Dad, when you left the car, you were clean shaven, and now you have like a 5-day growth of beard on. What happened?" He said, "Nothing, son. You know how I always let my beard grow out when we go camping. You know how you're always teasing me about looking like Ernest Hemingway? That's just what's happening. We're on the trip, and my beard's been growing." And that was not credible, because we had just driven up from Chatsworth on the first day of the trip. Unbeknownst to me, that a couple hours later, Thomas Stillings brought his young son, William Stillings, to the same store in McLeod, and the same event transpired. His dad admonished Brett to stay in the car, went into the store for 50 minutes, came out, and had about a 3-day growth of beard, because as Brett has explained, his dad actually took out a battery-powered electrical shaver and shaved his beard before going into the store, but still had about a 3-day growth of beard when he got out. So apparently what happened is they time looped. They were sent somewhere, They had a 1 or 3 or probably a 5-day seminar about what was going to transpire that summer, and then they were teleported back to the present and walked out of the store. When William Stillings and I reconnoitered the McLeod Market in 2011, there was a drunken soldier across the street from the McLeod Market. And, I should say, somebody dressed as a U.S. Army soldier who was feigning drunkenness. Because when he came down to the side of the door, the right side of the right window of my car, he said in a clear, non-inebriated voice, a sober voice, so what's going on, guys? And I actually told him the whole story. I said, my dad was with Parsons, his dad was at Lockheed Skunk Works, and Bendix, and NASA JPL. And when we were young men, we were brought up here by our fathers, and we got training up at the college, which is only exit 747. It's 2 exits north of exit 745 to McLeod, College of the Siskiyous. And he said, what about? You were apparently involved in some defense project? He said, yeah, they sent us to Mars via jump room. And he said, wow, and he's not drunk. And he said, wow, that's really heavy, guys. And every once in a while, people come through here telling those kinds of stories. And then I said to him, I leaned across Brett, and I said, officer, is it pretty much in our interest to leave this area immediately? And he said, yeah. So he's basically some kind of domestic security operative who was keeping an eye on what? The McLeod Market, where our fathers had taken us 30 years previously, and after 15 minutes each came out of that store with days of beard growth. So clearly they were using time travel to brief people in the intel community there for these kinds of projects. Here's Brett at about the age 13 that he was that summer. Here's Brett today. I always commend my friend William Stillings about the fact that had he not come forward and contacted me in March of 2010, I never would have recaptured my memories, and I wouldn't be talking to you today about the Mars Jump Room program. Brett has remembered with great clarity what happened, and in the way that I defeated my brainwashing after leaving Project Pegasus, Brett defeated the brainwashing that was imposed on all of us by the CIA after being trained at College of the Siskiyous that summer, and then after serving in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. Now, the next strange thing that happened is, I'll just give the kind of prescript to this. My dad and I pitch our tent on the lakes at Lake Siskiyou there on the northern side of the lake, and a couple hours later, Brett arrives with his dad, and his dad says to my father, "You may not know me, but we work for the same company," which wasn't the company of Jesus. It wasn't saying they were Jesuits. It was the CIA, right? As they were using in that era, that the CIA was simply the company. And his father then had Brett go to their uniquely pumpkin-colored minivan, which I identified to Brett before he sent me a scan of the photographs of that vehicle with this, this sort of late or mid 1970s pumpkin orange kind of color, if you remember that era. And he had Brett get a box out of the back of the car, and he showed me what he had, which was Tom Stillings had a piece of metal that was about 2 inches wide and about 6 inches long. And he said, "Now watch this, Andy." And he bent down, and he let go of the metal, and it hovered about 6 inches off the ground. And he said to my dad, I've showed this to my son, to Brett, but I don't have to show this to you, Ray, because you work with this. And again, this is the aerospace involvement with magnetics, anti-gravitics, and so forth that was already ongoing by summer of 1980. My dad had designed the metal alloy with which the ramjet was built, and apparently now was being consulted about what Tom Stillings called our boundary layer materials. So that was strange, having this little demonstration of this little hovering piece of metal. Not basically arresting the forces of gravity, but basically reverse magnetic propulsion. Basically, the polarity of the metal and the polarity of metals in the soil were causing the kind of effect when you put the same poles of two magnets together, you get kind of that pushing. Well, they had a form of metal alloy that actually hovers as a result of that effect. So that was the big event of the first day there, Saturday, the day we had arrived. the next day, Sunday, we're sitting around. We've had lunch, because we kind of bonded as, two fathers and sons as neighbors there in the campground. And precisely at 1 o'clock p.m., both of our dads stand up and start walking diagonally across the campground. And so Brett and I, being age 13 and 18 respectively, were certainly more fit than our dads at that age, and we started skipping ahead of them, seeing the direction they were going. And we went through 2 cars at an adjacent campsite, and the person who stepped forward in civilian clothing was this man, Edwin Eugene Aldrin Jr., the U.S. astronaut, a participant in projects Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, the second man to walk on the moon. And he walked through his vehicles. I think it was a sort of a pickup truck and a sedan, and he greeted us. And we obviously had never met Buzz Aldrin before. Brett would have a friendship with Buzz long after the jump room program. I just met him this one time at the campgrounds there. And he addressed us. He said, "Andy, Brett, nice to meet you guys. Well, let me tell you, fellas, you're soon going to be doing something that I did a few years back, and that's go off-planet. And let me tell you, guys, it's going to be the experience of a lifetime." So for some reason, they set up this meeting with Buzz Aldrin just to get a sense maybe of normalcy, that leaving the planet was normal or something. And that we would clearly, as individuals born in the 1960s, I in 1961, William Stillings in 1966, we would clearly identify with Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins in Apollo 11. The next morning, we left the campground to go to the University Extension that Monday, not in Weed, California, but the College of Siskiyou Extension building in Wairika, California. But something happened the previous night, so let me describe that. We're sitting around the campfire at about 10 o'clock at night, with all the sparks going up. You can see the whole Milky Way above us. And my dad looks across the campfire at me and says, "Boys," also addressing Brett, he says, "Boys, you're not here for a camping trip this summer, although we will be camping some of the time. We'll also be staying in hotels. You're here to participate in a specialized curriculum." And I said, "Dad, what are you talking about? We're going to be in school?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "What about?" And he said, "It's going to be a seminar that'll last for about 3.5 weeks, involving everything that you could possibly want to know about the planet Mars." And I said, "Dad, I just took my astronomy breadth requirement at UC San Diego. I'm going to be registering as an English major at UCLA in the fall. You know that. I actually ended up transferring into history." And I said, "I don't plan to become an astronaut. I don't know about Brett's plans, but, what are you talking about?" And he said, "Well, we're going to be going to first the Extension building and then to the Weed campus of College of the Siskiyous." And I said, "Why do we need to know everything about Mars, Dad? Why do we need to break up this vacation with schooling?" And he said, "Because some of you kids in the program are going to be going there." And just as we did after we encountered Buzz Aldrin, Brett and I looked at each other like, "Oh, look what our fathers have gotten us into, right? Fine kettle of fish you've gotten me into now." But so I said, "Dad, you're not kidding." He goes, "Nope." And I said, "Well, what's happened?" He said, "You have been selected among American young people to be some of the first American young people to go to the planet Mars, and you're going to be going there. At least some of you will be. So just give the seminar your best shot. Just listen to everything that's said, try to participate, and try to glean as much as you can from the curriculum." So the next morning we get up, and our fathers drive us in a carpool to the College of the Siskiyou Extension in Wairika. We go up the stairs. I remember thinking how prison-like it looked. And we went into the back center. There was a courtyard, and the classroom was in the left side of the inner courtyard of this rather small campus. It was really only like sort of one big connected building. And we then met our instructor, Major Ed Dames, who in 1980, on his own website until recently, was stating that he was a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army in the early 1980s. On November 10th of 2011, during my third appearance on Coast to Coast AM with Brett Stillings and Laura Eisenhower corroborating my account of having gone to Mars, because Brett had and Laura had been invited to do so, Ed Dames called in and denied that he was our instructor, stated that might be some sort of parallel reality event, and then stated the truth about the end of that summer, which he stated that he was stationed in Germany that summer. In fact, he told us at the end of our course that he was going to Germany, and that his girlfriend Marianne from Valencia, California, was not going to be going with him. I don't know if Ed Dames knows the fact that we remember the name of his girlfriend, but we do. He was saying, well, yeah, at the end of this, when we all go home, I'm going to be going to Germany to listen to Soviet troop movements on the Czech border or something. So on Coast to Coast, he alleged that he was in Germany that summer, so couldn't have been our instructor at College of the Siskiyous. And then he began using profanity, and his microphone was cut off. Okay, so I'm just giving the truth of what happened. We do not want to belittle or diminish the reputation of Ed Dames by stating the truth. He was our instructor. So if we're wrong, there is some alternate explanation for who our instructor was. It could have been a twin brother of Ed Dames that they've been working with. It could have been a parallel dimension of his experience where we were on our main timeline and he banked in from an adjacent timeline and was our instructor and then banked out. It could have been somebody imitating him. It could have been a holographic overlay of what we were fundamentally experiencing. But I and William B. Stillings and Bernard Mendez are in absolute agreement, and we have agreed never to back down from the truth of what we experienced, which is that Major Ed Dames, the remote viewing pioneer, was our Mars training officer that summer. In fact, he was Captain Ed Dames, we believe, but he's the guy that trained us. We can't back down from the truth. If he wants to continue to deny that he was in the Mars program, that's his right, but we're going to continue to state what we experienced, which was his tutelage as the scientific and technical intelligence officer from the Army, having been our instructor, and even meeting his girlfriend at that time. After a couple days of instruction from roughly about 8:30 to 2:30, 8:30 in the morning to 2:30 at night or afternoon, we then moved to a bungalow on the Weed campus, the main College of the Siskiyous campus. And then from those hot bungalows, we then moved to the Life Sciences building. So we were actually in 3 training locations when we were in the Shasta region that summer. In that class, which again was this factual overview going from the creation of Mars to what we knew, some of the major things we knew about its humanoid population presently, Dames emphasized that the 3 goals of our service in the Mars Jump Room program were going to be to help establish an extraterrestrial defense regime protecting Earth. And I'm using extraterrestrial there broadly defined, not just to the threat of hostile ETs, but all extraterrestrial threats like incoming asteroids and what have you. Second, to create a basis for claiming U.S. territorial sovereignty over Mars. The thought was that if we could put a presence there with permanent settlers and then periodic visitors, we would stake a claim under public international law to essentially claim that Mars was our sovereign territory as Americans. And then also to acclimate Martian humanoids and animals to our presence. In other words, we were being put there as a show, not of force, but as a show of the presence of Earthlings on Mars. Earthlings from Earth, not from previous contact with Earth. Now, he also explained that the emphasis would be, of the course, would be what to expect upon arriving on Mars via the jump rooms, learning about the lethal and non-lethal predators on the surface. And by this I mean inevitably lethal or not necessarily inevitably lethal predators on the surface, and how to operate as a team on the surface so as to survive. So we did a lot of really far-out exercises. I remember one time we had to look at a green box on a bar stool, and Regina Dugan said, we had to then yell out to everybody else in like a staccato sentence structure, just the essence of what was there. And Regina said, a green box on a bar stool, just sitting there. So I was proud that when I came out of the jump room facility on the surface of Mars and I saw one of the gray Martians up on the top of the building, I yelled, Courtney Hunt and Brett Stones were coming out of the jump room behind me into the darkness, sort of dusk, and I yelled, Court, Brett, a gray, on the ceiling, on the roof, observing us. Okay, so we did kind of have training and just staying in touch with our team members on the surface by yelling these short, meaningful sentences. So that succeeded. In fact, I'll tell the story of Bernard Mendez and I rescuing each other's lives in the same event. So next slide, please. Part 6, let's take a look at the 10 teenagers that were involved in our training group. Here's Brett Stillings, again, around age 13 during our training in the summer of '80. Here's Brett today. Here is Barack Obama in his famous photographs when he was a first-year student at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California. That's what he looked like. That's the guy. The three of us agree that was Barry Soetoro. Here is President Barack Obama today. We'll talk about the 2 denials that he's issued about his service. Here's Regina, or also known as, actually, I think the correct pronunciation is Regina Dugan. That's what we were apprised of during the program, and that was used when she was the director of DARPA, was Regina Dugan. Here's Regina around the time that President Obama appointed her the first female and the 19th historical director of the agency that gave the U.S. government time travel, namely the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And we continued to have contact with Regina after the program because she was in California at Caltech, having entered Caltech in fall of 1979 as a 16-year-old. So Regina was 17 years old when she was trained to go to Mars. Here is William Cameron McCool, known as Willie McCool, who was born, Regina was born on March 19th of 1963. Willie McCool was 5 days younger than me. He was born on September 23rd of 1961, just as Barry was also close to myself in age. Barry Obama was born on August 4th of 1961, about 45 days before I was, and then another 50 days before William Cameron McCool. Willie McCool was the pilot of in 1996, when I was becoming a lawyer up in Washington State. Willie had gone on to a career in aviation as a naval aviator who was then at Annapolis when we were being trained, and entered the Space Shuttle Corps as a 35-year-old in 1996. It's never too late to do something different in your life. And sadly, however, he died as the pilot of Space Shuttle Columbia when it was destroyed, re-entering Earth's atmosphere on February 1st of 2003. But Brett and I certainly have fond memories of Willie McCool. I mean, he was basically a cut-up. I mean, I would pass him in the jump room at El Segundo, and he would always do these things where he looked down and he was shocked to see you. And he'd say something like, "So you're still in the program? Oh, God." You know, he was quite a comedian. So it saddens us that he lost his life at such a young age, but in such a courageous way. Okay, the other 5 we don't know. One of the reasons I'm speaking out is so that not only those that we know were involved come forward, like President Obama, but that the other 5 teenagers come forward and contact me. We have the name and hair color of one of the others. His name was Eric, and he was a blonde. We believe he was from San Mateo, California, and we think he was studying either anthropology or physics at UC Santa Barbara. His name may have been either Dutch or Scandinavian, but Eric Schoenwald, or whatever your last name was, Schoenberg, we'd like you to come forward and tell the people about what we were doing back in the early 1980s, which is jumping to Mars. Now, curiously, the 5 that we've been able to identify by name and by persona, as it were, all had discrete or not so discrete Pasadena, California connections. So let's take a look at those. I was the youngest son of a career special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company, which became Parsons Corporation upon creating its 6-acre campus and moving the company from Los Angeles after leaving New York City in Pasadena, California. Barry was then attending Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, which is basically a suburb of Greater Pasadena. I mentioned how Regina Dugan had entered the California Institute of Technology, the leading sort of brainiac campus in the country, with all the profoundly talented math science type students, as a 16-year-old, the same year that Barry and I entered college in fall of 1979. Brett had several Southern California connections that are conspicuous. His dad was with Lockheed Skunk Works when we were in the jump room program, and then would go on to literally work for NASA JPL in Pasadena, another Pasadena, California connection. And then Willie McCool clearly had a Pasadena, NASA JPL connection in Pasadena, because he became an astronaut, and NASA JPL is headquartered in Pasadena, California. Now, working with Bernard Mendez, in part 7 here, we take a look at what were the 7 traits with which we believed they selected us. Now, of course, I had been in Pegasus, so I was sort of a known entity as a time traveler, a good errand and so forth, somebody who remembered what he saw when he was time traveling. But actually, Bernard Mendez gave me a kind of bizarre set of traits. Let's take a look at those. He stated basically that you all had to be of very high intelligence. We wanted everybody to have a team orientation. So like I had learned how to cooperate with my 4 older brothers and sisters and so forth. Barry Obama was certainly a kind of a laid-back, type B personality. That we have non-competitive personalities. They didn't want to send chrononauts to Mars that would run up a hill to be the first one to run up the hill. They wanted team members to sit where one team member might turn to the other and say, hey, listen, let's walk up to that hill over there. Because group cohesion was critical, just to not be separated from your group and possibly eaten on the surface. Okay, so we all had to be non-competitive in our personalities, and I think that's also exemplified in the fact that I had a pretty good jump shot in basketball, but I was a terrible wrestler in high school. I just didn't like grappling with somebody. I had had some skin problems as a result of Pegasus, and some major ones. And so I look back at my athletic career, and it was not particularly distinguished. I became much more competitive politically and academically, but they still had apparently found that each of us was ultimately self-directed and non-competitive in our activities. We all had to have an affinity for nature. We were the kind of kids who, when we were taken to campsites as little kids, when the tents were being set up, would not help set up the tents, but be all over the location, picking up rocks, checking out pine needles and that whole scene. We had to be intuitive problem solvers. Brett and I have gone back and remembered incidents where we recommended something that would be analogous to Buzz Aldrin using that Bic pen to repair the instrumentation of the lunar module and get them off the surface of the moon. Okay, I got a lot of that wasn't so much intuitive, but that was practical for my father, because my dad was a mechanical genius. In fact, one of his colleagues said at his funeral, he said, Andy, your dad was brilliant. I think you should know that. And I said, well, how do you mean? He said, had he been a better communicator, he would have become president of Parsons. I mean, that's quite a statement, Parsons being one of the world's largest engineering companies. He said he would come up with solutions that just astounded me at how simple they were and creative. Things like, how to do the air. He didn't work on this, but I'm just thinking of the types of things this man was talking about. Like when we designed that air regulator for the Apollo 13, we just cobbled together what would create an air conditioning unit from scratch. This was the kind of genius that my dad had, and some of it rubbed off on me. I think Brett had the same experience with his dad. Curiously, Bernard Mendez said, and also grandiosity. We wanted every last, teenage jumper to basically be a grandiosity case. And I said, why, Bernie? And he said, think about it. You're sending teenagers to another planet. You definitely want them to have like a Christopher Columbus complex, right? So when they looked through our statements of purpose, they were looking for young people who just had a large definition of themselves, even if it was sort of like a mental disorder. But that's curious in light of the fact that this small group of young people were fairly illustrious as a group later in life. And then also there's the possibility that they identified us through future social prominence, using quantum access to the present and saying that Barry would become president, Regina would become director of DARPA, Andy would become a crusading lawyer who would run for president, etc. Willie McCool would become a space shuttle astronaut. But Bernard agreed with me that we had to factor that in. But most of this is actually from Bernie. And Bernie, of course, wasn't really our peer in the program. He was the Air Force investigator who was being put in the program to investigate it and write a report about key questions of what the project was encountering. Like situations where somebody would be killed, literally eaten in half, or have their arm torn off, as I did, by a predator, and then be resurrected or have their limb reattached as if magically by the time they were debriefed by Ed Dames back in El Segundo. So, but yeah, I think of the personalities of, let's say, the captains of the ships when Western Europeans began traveling to the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere. I would certainly want to be sailing with a Columbus or a Vespucci or a Mercator or who did the circumvention of the world?
Magellan.
Magellan, or Magellan, who had a Napoleonic complex, right? Because you're going out there and your ships are sinking, you're running out of resources, your men are mutinying. I would certainly want to have like a George Washington personality type who had a big self-concept to be safe on the planet Mars. So that, I think that helped get us over the basic existential fear of being separated from Mother Earth. And it was fearsome. So there were 3 parents who were auditing virtually every class during the training program. I mentioned my dad's involvement. I mentioned in yesterday's lecture how he was the chief technical consultant or liaison between Parsons and the CIA on Tesla teleportation. BS, electrical engineering, Lehigh, 1951, a member of Eta Kappa Nu, associated professionally with the time travel professional organization IEEE. How he had designed the metal alloy so that the ramjet would not melt in our atmosphere or in our near-Earth environment from molecules of air or space dust, respectively. How he had repeated Nikola Tesla's teleportation experiments at the Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, during the 8 years that he was employed there between 1956 and 64. So I think this got my dad into the time-space program, in addition probably to his working on sensitive aerospace projects, his mastery of mathematics and physics at Lehigh, and just fate. But there he was in summer of 80, sitting behind me, auditing the class that we were being trained to go to Mars, knowing that he was probably not going to be medically approved to go because of his heart disease and his pulmonary performance as a result of his heart disease. Here's Brett's father, Thomas J. Stillings, when he was a lieutenant with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Tom was often sitting to my father's right in class. At that time, he was an operations analyst at Lockheed Skunk Works, so probably had sort of designed the way that the jump room class was going to unfold and maybe had some ambit over which individuals were selected. He also had a bachelor in engineering. He had the Navy connection that I was given and that Brett was given. He also had attended a naval postgraduate school curriculum, as I had in the evenings when I was at UCLA studying history in the day division. And he later went on to become an employee of NASA JPL. And then sitting a couple seats to his right in the back of the room at the Life Sciences building was the mother, the biological mother of Barack Obama, Stanley Ann Dunham. She was a very nice lady. She had served alternately as a USAID, Agency for International Development consultant in Kenya and Indonesia. She would go on to earn a PhD in anthropology from the University of Hawaii at Manoa by 1993, I think. It's stated by others that she was an agent for the Central Intelligence Agency while traveling to Kenya and Indonesia and marrying into those cultures. And one day she gave us a brilliant afternoon lecture on cross-cultural communications if we encountered Martians directly when we were on the surface. And I remember her referencing the fact that she knew a lot about cross-cultural communications by being in cross-cultural marriages while married to men from Kenya and Indonesia, respectively. She was a delightful person. I feel that the President's mother has been completely besmirched in the press. She was a wonderful human being. She was gracious, funny, intelligent, kind. And Brett and I was just hanging out with her in the classroom. She was a wonderful lady. So, we have this issue in part 9 here of the 2 future presidents. The first thing I remember about Barry Obama, or Satoru as he was then known, is we were coming out of class and he walked alongside me on my left. My dad was on my right. We were walking back to our cars there from the Life Sciences building. And he said, I really can't believe what we're studying. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we're being trained to be some of the first people to go to another planet. I mean, how far out is that? I said, I know. So some mornings I have to remind myself that that's what we're studying. So he was really thinking with philosophical profundity about what we were being set up to do, which is go to another planet. And Barry was a great guy. I mean, he was smart, thoughtful, considerate, had a good positive attitude. He was funny. And so I'm also mortified when I see all this dirt being thrown at Barack Obama, because quite frankly, when I think about my college-age peers, he was clearly one of the standouts as a human being, as an overall human being. Now, we know that the Barry Satoru we served with and were trained with in this early phase was President Obama because his kindergarten teacher provided the press, during the birther controversy a year or two ago, provided his academic file from Indonesia, where he had lived from age 5 to 10, and he was identified in his kindergarten file as Barry Soetoro, having been born or come to Indonesia. Well, that must have been 1968 as he was entering that course at his class. And then he was of the Muslim faith, and that his name was Barry Soetoro. And she also provided the group photograph in kindergarten in first grade, where we see a young Barack Obama circled here being identified as Barry Soetoro. So how many Barry Soetoros can there be in the world? I mean, a Western first name with an Indonesian last name, not too common. Here is Barry and his mom, Stanley, at the time of his high school graduation from Punahou School in Hawaii. This is essentially what they looked like when we met them in the jump room program. Again, the affable mom that Barry had. We also got to know them well because after we left the dorms at College of the Siskiyous, a group of us kind of split off and were staying for days at the Finlandia Motel in the city of Mount Shasta. That included President Obama, myself in this extended picture here, Regina, and Brett, and our parents, and other jumpers. The thing about the presidency began, and did I tell this yesterday, where my dad said 2 future presidents? Okay, yes. So there was a reference by Tom Stillings to his son about how there was a future president class, and then when my dad apprised him that there were 2, Brett says that later, when they left the classroom, his father was just like apoplectic, saying things like, what do they think they're doing? They put 2 future presidents in this program? I mean, this program is dangerous. What are they thinking? So I mentioned that anecdote yesterday, and then that kind of gave way to greater discussion. I mean, Barry's mom, Stanley, was even talking about his future presidency as the first African-American president during the going-away dinner that we had at the Creamery restaurant, which is now basically a tavern and restaurant, but was then kind of a restaurant that featured basically like fancy ice cream dessert type things, which was on College Road there. The front of the restaurant was then on College Avenue, down the street from College of the Siskiyous. Now, during the 3.5 weeks we were all there, Barry, Regina, and I became CIA analysts about a specific data set. We were sequestered. Well, what happened is about toward the end of the program, the end of the 3.5 weeks, Barry, Regina, and I were approached by Ed Dames and my dad and taken to Ed Dames' office, where Ed announced to us that we would all be teleported to the beginning of the summer, spend the whole summer sequestered there at College of the Siskiyous, and then at the appropriate time be reintroduced back into our main group, the main timeline, as it were, that the training course was taking place in. And he said, I know that you will because you already have. In other words, he had already encountered us when we jumped forward to June of 1980. So we were just hanging out in kind of some study corrals at the undergraduate library. There's no graduate library, basically at the library at College of the Siskiyous. How they could pick a future president who would become a Harvard-educated lawyer, the first woman to direct DARPA after getting a PhD in mechanical engineering from Caltech in the early 90s, and a Cambridge-educated lawyer who would become a whistleblower and presidential candidate, I don't know. But I think it was intentional. Because what they asked Barry, Regina, and I to do that summer is analyze about 4 inches of French intelligence data about Mars in the French language. And I had taken 2 years of junior high school French and 2 years of high school French, but I basically knew how to count and give the days of the week after all that ended. I'm not a natural linguist. So what is it? Lundi, mardi, mercredi, jeudi, vendredi, samedi, dimanche, or something like that. So I know a little bit of French to maybe count or know what day of the week it is if I look at a French newspaper. But I was just gleaning about 25% of what these 4 inches of data said. I think Regina was fluent and Barry was more fluent than I in French. So we were sequestered there, almost to the point of like going into a creative fugue state. I mean, we were really isolated, and we had been told not to talk too much to each other, just to say hi, but not talk about our theses, to keep our theses of what the intelligence data said about the thesis. The question was, do these documents reveal that the humanoid population on Mars is a threat to the humanoid population on Earth? benevolent towards us, or cannot be determined. Which is it? And don't talk to your colleagues, We don't want you, the three of you, talking to each other. At least if you do talk, just to say hi, so that your colleagues have some sense of normality, of interacting with other human beings during these months you're going to be spending here. We just want you to stick to inconsequential themes. Don't tell them what your thesis is, and arrive at your own opinion. So we were walking at the end of the summer, at the appointed hour. They sent somebody over to our tiny offices over in the dorms, our tiny, living quarters over in the dorms. They were like really tiny one-bed dorm suites, almost like prison cells. And they said, well, your time to rejoin the rest of the group and give Major Dames or Captain Dames your theses has arrived. So we're walking over there. He left, and then we walked over by ourselves to Ed Dames' office. And I said, well, look, we can to the other two, I said, look, we can let our guard down now because we've already written our theses and we've arrived at our own opinions, and we can't influence each other now. And I said, Regina, what did you determine? And contrary to my opinion, she said, I think they represent a threat. And I said, wait a minute, Regina, we're engaging in the hegemony of going to their sovereign planet and putting our explorers there. And then she cited the incident in which several of our astronauts had died on the surface of Mars, one of the French intelligence reports indicated. We had asked the human population, our government on Mars, civilization as it were, to rescue our personnel. They agreed to do so, and then they reneged and didn't perform. And those several astronauts died. I guess of exposure or starvation or predation on the surface. Regina believed that showed that they weren't trustworthy, not because they refused to rescue our personnel, but they declined to after promising to, which shows some malice, was her opinion. I said, but Regina, do you think we're doing that when extraterrestrials come to our planet? This was pre-Roswell, right? But I'm just saying, do you remember hearing any time where they stated as a human right on Earth that if you're an extraterrestrial, you have the right to be rescued by the U.S. government? I mean, you're imposing a higher morality on the inhabitants of a planet that we're proposing on ourselves when territorially aggressing against the Martian population. But she got really angry at me because she believed, now of course she was more adept at French, so maybe she was right. But I didn't read anything that I could read of the French intelligence documents to determine that the Martians were any threat to us. Of course, I had met three very friendly ones as an 8-year-old in summer of '70. And Barry, as is indicated by the fact that he's a highly skillful political tactician because he reached the White House as the first African American president at age 47, didn't say anything. I said, what about you, Barry? What did you determine? And he said, I can't tell you. And I said, why not? He said, because it's against what we were instructed to do. We have to take this program seriously. We're going to be jumping to Mars. And I said, okay, if you don't want to tell us, but we're just going to deliver the thesis and then never know what the other two researchers had determined. So that's how it fell out. What I guess since Barry has, I think, been a pretty intellectually capacious president. I mean, if you think about our former presidents, I think he stacks up very well for actually the erudition that he's brought to the presidency and the depth of his analysis. I think what he probably concluded was that it was both. That we were both dangerous to each other because we were on the threshold of interplanetary contact, but that equally both civilizations could be benevolent to each other. He probably gave a kind of a dichotomous or trichotomous kind of answer because it's present in his public statements in other areas. And I know that Regina was taking the hawkish view, I was taking the dovish view, but then again, I became an activist lawyer and not a science officer for the U.S. government or President of the United States, at least not yet. Well, the next summer of 1981, I was placed with one CIA agent, Courtney Maurice Hunt. Now, this isn't a picture of Courtney. This picture is of Mike Roman, the national sales director of the Bulova Watch Company, when he was photographed at the Grand Ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel when Senator Robert Francis Kennedy was shot there on June 5th of 1968. When this picture was scrutinized, an Irish journalist by the name of Shane O'Shaughnessy stated that this was Gordon Campbell of the CIA, somebody who had been involved, at least potentially, in the assassination of President John Kennedy. It was then determined that it wasn't him, but it was in fact Mike Roman, because the Bulova Watch Company, under General Omar Bradley as chairman, was present at a national sales meeting in the Ambassador at the same time that the DNC was meeting there, or at least the Kennedy campaign was meeting there in 1968. I use this photograph because this looks exactly like Courtney M. Hunt looked when I and Brett Stillings were introduced to him in the summer of 1981. He was a career CIA officer who began jumping over enemy lines during the Korean conflict to gather intelligence. In fact, had a bad back as a result of a mishap as a parachutist into North Korea. One of the first things that Courtney did that summer was he took me to a chem lab at Cal State University Northridge. There we see its famous creative sign that you can see CSUN from 360 degrees, and showed me how to use the respirator I was going to be using on the surface of Mars. He also took me to Lockheed Skunk Works, where Brett's father worked, and they had me stand inside this video console that had images, moving images on all four sides walls of this small room, and I had to hold a gun and move around either 90 degrees or 180 degrees every 30 seconds, because that's what we're going to be expected to do on the surface of Mars to protect ourselves and our team members from predation. One of the inevitably lethal predators could run at 70 miles per hour. In fact, Courtney Hunt and I once saw one of the dinosaur-like predators run for about a half a mile at 70 to devour a kind of a water buffalo-like creature. So there was also the trip to Lockheed Skunk Works that Hunt facilitated. Now, can you go forward one? I want to see where I am. Okay, just and back. Because, yeah, here we go. There are essentially, well, here we have Lockheed Skunk Works where I'm practicing protecting with the gun from predation. Because there's actually two types of predators on Mars. The first are some of these plesiosaur-like creatures that look like turtles with long necks and horse-like heads, like the lake monsters that we've seen. Nessie at Loch Ness, Champ at Lake Champlain in New Hampshire, and Ogopogo in Lake Okanagan in British Columbia. But this thing was not a turtle. It had teeth all the way down its throat. But the benefit was that it really couldn't run as fast as we could, so while it was a predator, we really would have had to be cornered by it almost accidentally, or run up upon by it, for it to even get its teeth in our legs or whatever. This was one of the non-lethal predators, but it was a predator. But here was a drawing that's pretty close to what the lethal predators looked like. They basically had heads that looked like T-Rex, although Brett remembers they were a little bit more narrow across the front and a little bit more chicken-like. And they had much more supple bodies like this, like velociraptors as depicted on Jurassic Park. And we were told that we would not, if they were anywhere near us, we would not be able to outrun them. We're actually trained in one exercise at College of the Siskiyous of running in zigzag patterns just to try to get them to become disinterested in eating us, even though we would obviously exhaust ourselves doing so. So this was pretty much the Joker card. Because there were non-lethal predators that I could shoot and repel, but I was also advised to never shoot the lethal predators, the inevitably lethal predators, because all I would do is basically antagonize them. And they were known to sometimes spend hours nibbling at somebody if you had antagonized them. I was given a photo ray gun. And in the backyard, the La Cañada backyard of the Stillings family, Tom Stillings showed me that in the case of small and medium-sized animals, we would just incinerate them into fine ash. And he demonstrated with a goat, and he said, "Watch this, Andy." And he shot about 30 feet across their backyard and turned a young goat just into feathery ash. But then he admonished me, you wouldn't want to put that kind of charring on the side of the leg, in a black spot on the side leg of one of the inevitably lethal predators, because he was going to be really mad and spend a slow time eating you. Okay, so this was basically to repel smaller predators. I went off protocol, and I once used it upon Brett's insistence on splitting a rock in half, and water burbled out. And I've been telling that in lectures for several years now, and now NASA has announced that there's water immediately under the surface of Mars. Okay, so even the space agency is starting to corroborate my independent account. But that was the only time, I'm happy to say that was the only time I even fired my gun on the surface of Mars, was just to split the rock in half. I was also given a small dose of, not morphine, not strychnine, what's the other poison? I always forget this. You know that Goring took to kill himself?
Cyanide?
Cyanide, thank you. For some reason, I guess because of the word, the stem scion means blue, right? I covered it in Latin stems in English at UCLA, but I can never open my mouth and say cyanide. But yeah, I was given a capsule of cyanide in the event that I would prefer to suicide, for example, rather than being slowly eaten. And I like to refer to that as the fuckatol that I was administered in the event that I had to basically pull the Joker card and check out. Next slide, please. Now, one of the things that Hunt did was not only handle me for the Mars program, but he was trying to handle me by wherever the CIA wanted me on the planet. And at the end of that summer of '81, right before I was going to enter my third year of college at UCLA, after having transferred from UC San Diego, he told me that I want you to put in an intercampus transfer. And I said, where? I've already attended 2 colleges. He said, Columbia. And I said, you're telling me if I apply to Columbia now, a couple of weeks before the term begins, I'm going to be able to go there to an Ivy League school? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, I don't want to go. I don't want to go to school in New York City. My family doesn't have the money for me to come home for Christmas if I do that. I don't think I can afford the rents or the danger of being a victim of a crime in New York, in that era. I mean, by 1979-80, New York was basically unsafe territory. So I made one of the major mistakes in my life, and I didn't transfer to Columbia to get an Ivy League degree as an undergraduate. But one of my fellow jumpers did, Barack Obama. As researched by George Stephanopoulos of ABC News, and who interviewed 400 classmates of Barack Obama. He was not in New York while he was supposedly attending Columbia. And also as field tested, or what have you, as researched by Wayne Allen Root, who was one of George Stephanopoulos and Barack Obama's classmates in class of '83 at Columbia. Wayne Allen Root, I believe he questioned 75 of their classmates, and they were all political science majors, as Obama was supposed to have been. And those 75 poli-sci graduates of the class of 1983 of Columbia University in New York City, none of them could place Barack Obama in New York City. What I can add to the controversy about the President's Columbia baccalaureate degree is that I was instructed by the CIA to transfer from UCLA to Columbia the same time he was, and he went. I've even communicated with one of the professors who's looking into this, saying, why won't you guys touch the issue of why he was even transferred to Columbia? What Hunt had told me is that they would simply use our shadow enrollment at Columbia as a cover for involving us in the jump room program further, and even espionage on Earth. We know that Barack Obama went to Pakistan in 1981 at a time when there was a travel ban on Americans going there that the State Department had imposed, the U.S. State Department had imposed. So Barack Obama shouldn't even have been allowed to have gone, apparently, to Pakistan as an undergrad, but he did. So he must have been using his Indonesian passport. Hence, he must have been registered at Columbia as an Indonesian or foreign student. All I know is that the term, the fall 1981 term that he decided or had earned the ability or the right to attend Columbia after having a B- grade point average at Occidental, he ended up graduating from Columbia, and I was instructed by CIA to go there, but didn't attend, but he apparently did because he was one of our fellow jumpers. And in fact, Courtney Hunt may have been the CIA agent who instructed him to put in the intercampus transfer and go to Columbia. So, 2 jump rooms, one in New York City and one in El Segundo, California. Here's the one at the corner of Imperial Avenue East and West in Sepulveda, 999 North Sepulveda. And Brett Stillings determined that the CIA building in El Segundo is exactly 2 miles as the bird flies from where the jump room itself was. Interesting finding, exactly 2 miles. The first of my 2 training jumps were in summer of 1981. The first time, it was always a tradition to go up by yourself, so you would be sufficient to go by yourself if you were called to do so. I went to the building in El Segundo, jumped to Mars, and then came out of an elevator that was 1 story below ground and out through the eye of a large skull. This is a large skull that I found in NASA image PIA 10214, but it's not the one that I arrived at. But the whole Face on Mars controversy is now in its 2nd generation. The face on Mars at Cydonia is one of thousands of heads and faces of primates on the surface of Mars. The Martians use large heads to indicate where there are access points to their underground civilization, and they use images of different primates and reptilians and so forth to show, kind of as signage, to show where there's danger in the area. So they'll show a vicious reptoid, or they might show like a laughing humanoid as signage to indicate where you do or do not want to be on the surface. But they use large skulls extensively. The second time I went up with Courtney Hunt, and we went about a quarter of a mile from the skull that we arrived at, and this is one from Douglas, Arizona. It's just from our planet. But it was cobbled together from local rock. There was a door with a screen door on it. That's where I had the encounter with the man with the lower extremities of a grub who came bounding towards us with a chain around his neck, kind of like as a yard dog to scare us away. And when he got right towards us, Courtney Hunt kind of lunged at him like that, and he turned around and started bailing woefully like a wounded dog, which is a strange kind of guard dog. Then we went in and interacted with a settler on the surface of Mars named Howard. There were empty canned goods all over the floor, and he started scrambling and tripping over them because he thought we were there to assassinate him. And Courtney said, "Howard, we're not here to kill you. We're here just to see how you're doing." And he was just jabbering away how one of his team members had been a victim of predation and so forth. So this confirms the claims made by Michael C. Ralph